By adopting the classic ideology of the artist as creator, as genius, artists were no longer considered to be merely workmen and were given greater autonomy in their creations, too often still within the boundaries and specifications determined by the patron who was financing the venture. In order to obtain his autonomy, however, the artist has to first prove himself, to prove his skills and his ability to understand and interpret not just the requirement of the patron but the subject matter and at hand and the conceptual representation of this subject matter through innovation and painting, texture, perspective, composition, and draughtsmanship. The artist himself was recognized as a symbol of status and power, and his name alone could constitute value, as in the case of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Titian, who effectively established that was to become known as the High Renaissance and the express quality that came to be expected of the artists of the age. No longer was value attributable solely to the material cost of the work, but was now being accredited to the design of the work, the intellectual subject matter, and the skill and prestige of the artist who created the composition. And the more famous they became, the more highly sought out they were by the wealthy patrons who hoped to leverage off to their success. The circle completed itself as the artist in turn became more renowned as a result of such an association. This is then evident in the relationship between corporate sponsorships and the arts of today, where partnerships were being established to the benefit of both entities, which each part can be seen to be in its for its own gain. There is the potential for this to have positive implications on both sides. This politicizing of art is to be discussed in more details in the later chapters. First, however, it is necessary to examine how these changes in the ways of patronage continue to evolve into the 17th centuries and beyond. Nationalism, the Industrial Revolution, and the commoditization of art, the 70th to 90th centuries. Michael Foss, in The Age of Patronage, asserts the arts are naturally susceptible to changes in the social order and to changes in the ways of patronage. The years following the Renaissance were filled with vast changes in the way the people viewed themselves, their surroundings, and how they drew about the world. This was the commencement of the Age of Enlightenment, otherwise known as the Age of Reason, which resulted from the weakening of the Catholic Church through religious reformation, rejecting the dogma imparted by the Church in favor of a route of reason through national inquiry. It was also a period that brought with it new players in the global market, with other countries outside of Central Europe, Italy, Spain, Portugal, beginning to take on prominent roles. These beginnings, however, tending to vary across Europe. The Netherlands, in particular, stands out in early 7th century and world power, not only in the arts but in economic stability and social infrastructure, as well as trade and industry. Its history acts as a precursor of what will eventually come to pass in Britain and then the rest of Europe over the course of the next century. The Enlightenment was a period that revolved almost entirely around the increasing utilization of the printing press and the dissemination of information on a growing scale to people of all languages and at all levels of society. Book publishers were facing a uptaped market, one that was eager to absorb as much information as possible, and the capitalist ideology that arose from this made universal literacy a possibility and allowed rapidly growing numbers of people to think about themselves and to relate themselves to others in profoundly new ways. Moreover, people were becoming more adventurous. The opening the opening up of previously undiscovered trade routes around the world introduced Europeans to new foreign people and environments in the East Indies, China, or Africa. This constant research for new opportunities, innovative ways of doing things revealed unexplored avenues for people, growing their awareness of the world, as well as creating further opportunities for increased wealth at all levels. Society was changing and evolving, and with it new forms of art and patronage were being defined. Commercialization in Europe took over from traditional forms of patronage as seen in the Renaissance, as artists began creating art directly to the maker through art dealers, now among some of the most important buyers of art. Commissions were still in place, but rather than being the sole domain of the aristocratic class, they were taken up by governments and departments of state to decorate town halls. Guilds, as well as business owners such as tavern keepers, wine dealers, and craftsmen, also began purchasing art, if not for decorative purposes, that for the ability to be converted into cash without much difficulty. Pictures were goods which had a commodity value, just like a pair of trousers or any other service. Other avenues for selling works included auctions and lotteries. Individuals could also visit the artist directly buying art from their studios. Art was no longer a sole domain of the upper classes, and the more the demands increased amongst the growing middle class, the more opportunities there were for artists to become their own masters. In addition to this, subject matter was also changing according to the times and the increasing demand for work. Religious subject matter was fast becoming irrelevant, and large mythological, allegorical masterpieces were providing to intellectual for middle classes. Rather, secular works were becoming more popular, landscapes and genre paintings appealing to the various social classes, now with the purchasing power to buy art. Painting was to a certain extent removed of sacred or spiritual meaning, targeting instead the more secular or basic interests of the common man. This led to a distinct separation between artists who were producing art for the masses and those who remained inclined to produce art of a higher caliber, still entrenched with meaning and representation. It was the beginning of the separation between elite art and public art, and it's discussed in more detail further on in this chapter. One of the ensuing changes to arise as a result of these new changes in the social order was the emergence of a nationalist ideology in the late 18th century, where a growing consciousness based on common decent language and religion, achieved through the increasing literacy of the publication, emerged among similar groups of individuals. The rise of nationalism led to a distinct difference in the way individuals, societies considered themselves adopting new ways of identifying with those of the same social order. People began to realize that they were part of a greater whole, members of communities that share similar characteristics different of those of neighbor states. It was a sense of belonging that encourages contribution on behalf of each member. Each able person in the community was required to work in the order to better the existing social structure. But unlike working for a master of feudal law, the benefits of such labors could be seen in improvements to the community and in returns benefits that increases wealth, status and general standards of living. This sense of community, independent from the traditional religious and dynastic ties common in the Renaissance, allowed individuals to associate themselves with a chosen doctrine brought into being by the growing enlightenment of the ages. Rather, a sense of kinship emerged, an immediate connection with all incorporated in the same nation state, no matter how extensive, which led to dual feelings of belonging and independence from a higher rule. Benedict Anderson, 1991, refers to this as an imagined community, limited in that it is confined by its boundaries and by existence of other nations outside of its borders, but with a resultant sense of belonging that exists amongst members of the same communities in spite of their distinct separations from the another. Anderson. No single person can now no single person can know all of the members of the community, but their sense of kinship and belonging remains. As individuals became more and more aware of their place in a multicultural world, so their ties to the pre-existing religious modes of thinking began to wane. As people's independence grew, so a greater number of choices became available to them. They either elected to be a part of the greater community in which they lived and worked, or they didn't. And this idea of having the choice, superficial as it may seem, made the sense of belonging all the more powerful. This, combined with the growing literacy of the population and the increasing consciousness as a result, provided the opportunity needed for a nationalist ideology to be born, take shape, setting the stage for the modern nation. One of the consequences of this rise of nationalism and the growing awareness amongst the people was an increase in political thought, particularly amongst the lower classes that had previously been excluded from any participation in political activities. As people began to gain greater understanding, to develop critical abilities, they began and demand more, particularly of those whom they perceived to be in position of power. The growing middle classes of merchants, lawyers, doctors, and the other professionals of bourgeoisie also grew to be frustrated by the demands of the aristocracy. Educated as a result of the Enlightenment, they believed in equality and social justice, and so came to resent the overt privilege of the aristocratic class, whose entitlement to such status was too bare as opponent to those who had worked and earned their privileges. As a result of national struggles, social uprising and warfare were common and often reflected nationally in the art produced over the period. Once again, art became propaganda, but acting in this instance to behalf of the national and the people, as opposed to the church. Art continued to reflect on the conditions of society as on the artist's perception of what they saw around them, which effectively drummed up strong beliefs of patriotism. One of the more famous examples of a nationalist art is Eugene Lacroix's Liberty Leading the People, in which Lacroix portrays the rising of French people against Charles X as led by Liberty, who holds in her hand the tricolor flag of the French Revolution. The French Revolution was the launching pad for nationalism in Europe. This marks the beginning of an age of empowerment in which the common man could stand up from himself and fight for what would be classified today as his basic human rights. Emotions were running high at all levels of society and now reflect this, feeding the feelings of frustration and resentment that the proletariat had towards the aristocracy. Traditional forms of private patronage continued to decline as artists produced works directly for this actively growing market, submitting pieces directly to galleries and museums without waiting for commissions. Works were not being valued according to their intrinsic worth, determined according to the skills of the artist, their popular reputation in the marketplace, as well as form, content, and design. This was revolutionary art, however, produced in large scale for maximum impact. It was not available to the common man, through it appealed to his sense of outrage. Rather, it was directed at the growing bourgeoisie who could afford to make such a public statement and whose increasing finances could pay for a luxury product. Within this capitalist society, art was still a commodity, though its audience was becoming more refined. Running currently with these social changes and inextricably tied to the rise of the nationalist ideology was a growing industrialization among the nation states. The Industrial Revolution, which started in Europe in the late 18th to early 19th centuries and quickly spread throughout the world, impacted almost all areas of human society and established new defining categories for class divisions, and with nationalism, the Industrial Revolution witnessed the escalating decline of the traditional classes of elite, the nobility and gentry, in favor of a rise of a new middle class of businessmen and industrialists. This new bourgeoisie gradually rose to become the new ruling class in industrialized nation states, opening the door for the rapid expansion of commerce and the establishment of capitalist society, according to Nigel Blake and Francis Frasina in 1993. This 19th century capitalists controlled expressive new powers of production, new materials technology, new technology of management, and consequently new kinds of knowledge and abilities, and orientated to extracting value more exhaustively from an ever wider range of sources. But more wealth and more people come under the domination of capitalism, and the capitalists, the industrialists, financial speculators, the entrepreneur, dealer, etc. Especially after 1848 and the Second Empire of Napoleon III eventually assumed the dominant role in politics and human relations. And, at, and as this new middle class continued his ascent with the ever-expanding capitalist society, so there arose increased opportunities for employment for the lesser classes, doctors and lawyers, office workers, factory supervisors, and highly skilled workers, with the distinct exception of the unskilled workers at the bottom of the hierarchy, with a resultant escalation in general standards of living. This in turn provided a breeding ground for aspiration. The more one has, the more one wants, and as each class division seeks to emulate the behavioral characteristics of those above them, so there developed a wider interest in accumulating wealth through the possession of goods, and in doing so ultimately accumulating status. It was a new era of consumerism and one that affected the production of art to great extent. The practices of consumption and production are interlinked. How artists paint will be affected by their own understanding of what they are doing, and perhaps by their audience's understanding of what they are doing. All artists' productions are governed by assumptions, either by some mental or unconscious notion of who or how the imagined view might be, or by having a particular patron in mind, and in many instances by both. As art became available to a wider audience, so it had to mold itself to be to the requirements of that audience, to satisfy the needs that and wants of those who could afford to make the capital outlay for the work, where previously the patron would manage how a work was created, its composition and construction, with the financial outcome being predetermined and agreed upon. Now the artist was acting as an independent operator, creating works of her own volition. As a result, in order to sell works in the open markets, he had to speculate what these unnamed individuals would appreciate and be prepared to pay for. The artist also needed to determine whom he was creating works for, the general public or the higher earning elite. This distinction made a substantial difference to what was produced and the manner in which it was done. For the first time, our producer had to take account of economic issues such as supply and demand. They had to understand value, not just in the cost of materials, but in the time taken to create the work, and they had to consider the varied likes and dislikes of a much broader audience. The most evident example of this in the mid to late 19th century can be seen in the work of the Romantics, who began experimenting with painterly techniques and texture surfaces. Once again, Lacroix is the prime example of an independent romantic artist who broke away from the traditional prescriptions of the Académie in France with his expressive use of color and visible brushstrokes, as seen previously in the works of Rubens and Rembrandt. Such emotional techniques were considered to be rather feminine by intellectuals of the Academy, for they had no relation to the intellectual theory of the time, atmosphere came to take on a physical role in these works, created through painterly coloristic effects, and deep in a painting was explored through asymmetry and diagonal recession. By critically examining conventional standards in art production and engaging with the new subjects and themes through new methods of production, the Romantics were able to create new forms of art that appealed to the public, works that were uncommissioned and openly available for sale. In this growing capitalist society, where value and the construct of value were being consistently redefined in economic terms, one can see a new market emerging a market where art is no longer considered an object to to own and as a reflection solely of wealth and status, but as a commodity itself, available for sale to the open market, and as a value in economic terms is screwed through the exchange of objects, most particularly those that are hard to come by. So the limited nature in an inherent originality of an artwork works to its advantage. It is largely for this reason, along with their mounting popularity amongst almost all cases of citizens of at the time, that the Romantics can be accredited for their contribution to the establishment of the modern market in art dealing.